Okay, I think we'll start.
Yeah.
Welcome everyone. Throughout February, we will be celebrating LGBT plus History Month in the UK with a series of online events. This afternoon, we will join Chloe Foster from Sussex Rainbow Counselling on the subject of pronouns. If you have any questions for Chloe, pop them in the Q&A box and we'll go through them at the end of the talk. Just a reminder that this is a public platform and is being recorded, so please don't share any confidential information. Welcome, Chloe. It's lovely to have you with us today. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to do this talk, and as I said before, great to see so many people. My name is Chloe Foster. I'm a counsellor and a trainer, and I specialise in working with gender and sexual diversity. I'm a member of the LGBTQ community myself as a queer woman, and in my counselling practice, I see predominantly LGBTQ clients. So this is a topic that feels really important and really close to my heart, as it's something that I see a lot, and it's something that I train a lot of counsellors around, as I feel pronouns are really, really important. So just to give you a very brief overview of who I am, before training as a counsellor, I had a great interest in working in the LGBTQ communities, and I worked for several different organisations in the LGBTQ community. I worked as an LGBTQ youth worker, and I also worked as an events coordinator for an LGBTQ mental health charity. In addition to this, I've been teaching and training has been something that's been ongoing part of my career in most of my roles over the past, I think, 17 years. I have a degree in education, so I'm really passionate about sharing knowledge and information, and I'm really excited that Wolverhampton University have invited me here to talk about this topic today for your students and staff. I'm aware that this talk is also open to the general public as well. So I have tried to make this as accessible as possible to everyone listening. I've got some slides that I'm going to be talking through, so I'll just pop them up here. This talk is also part of LGBTQ History Month, because it's February, and although pronouns affect us all, they can be even more so important when we're thinking around stuff around gender, and I'll explain more when we get started. So, okay, so what are we going to cover today? I've broken up this talk into 3 parts. And the first part, we are going to talk about, oh, it's covering up on my screen. I'm not seeing the top of the screen. Is that still sharing? We're going to talk about privilege, terminology, what are pronouns, pronouns and gender, and our assumptions. The second part of the talk, we're going to talk about gender neutral pronouns, why pronouns are not preferred, alternating pronouns, and no pronouns. And lastly, the third part of the talk, we'll talk about inclusive language and my 5 top tips for pronouns. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to let you all know that I've put together a free pronouns guide for you all that summarises the things I'm going to be talking about on this talk today. The link to grab that guide is on the screen now, bit.ly/pronouns guide. And I think somebody from the team is going to be popping that in the chat. I will mention it again at the end, so don't worry if you've missed that. So you just click on that link and pop your name and email in on the box that comes up on my website, and you'll immediately be sent the free guide. Okay. So part 1, privilege, terminology, what are pronouns, pronouns and gender, and our assumptions. I felt like it was really important to start this talk by thinking about me and you and thinking about privilege. It's important that we think about ourselves before talking about other people or other things. And privilege feels a really important place to start. And I wanted to really recognise my own privilege around pronouns. What I mean by that is I have a privilege around pronouns. My pronouns are she and her, and people always get them right. I never have to tell people what my pronouns are. I never have to correct people. They always guess it right, and they always get it right. So this is a really privileged place to be in. You might be sitting there listening today and thinking that's the same for you. Maybe your pronouns are people always get your pronouns right. And you might be wondering, what's the big deal about this? And actually, there is a big deal for many people. To put this a bit more into context, I want to give some examples of some other things that are not necessarily pronoun related. You might be wondering what all these images are here. So we're going to think about names. And I've got this image here of rows and rows of mugs with names on in the image here on the slides. And you can see that they've got people's names on them. And I wonder if you've ever had the experience of being in a shop and looking at these mugs with all the names on them, or it might be notebooks or pencils or something that's got lots of names on them, and thinking, my name is not there. And how does that feel, that it's just been missed out? It's only for the common names that are there. Or maybe your name is there, but it's not spelled the way that you spell it. How does that feel? And that, although it's different from pronouns, feels a little bit like how it feels for people when their pronouns are not listed or their pronouns are not respected or valued. Your name is just not there. Another example around names is many of you watching today may have a name that's you use that's different from your birth name. For example, your birth name might be Jessica and nobody calls you that. Everyone calls you Jess. Or maybe it's Jonathan or Christopher, but actually everybody calls you John or Chris or Chrissy. And even if you haven't got that experience yourself, perhaps you know other people in your life close to you that do have that experience. And how does it feel when people continually get it wrong, when you have to correct them? Or you have to say when you're in a new class and the person reads out the lecturer reads out the register, or however they do it, and they email you and they use the name that's on the register, which is perhaps the name that you've been registered as, and it's not the name that you use day to day. Feels clunky, feels not quite right. Also, how does it feel when you have to share your name and you have to always say, oh, it's Claire without an I, or something like that. It's a different spelling, or you have to tell somebody how do you pronounce that? How do you say the name? And how does that feel? And titles as well. It can be another way of experiencing, like people who have Mr. as a title have a privilege in the fact that they never have to share their marital status. But people using Miss or Mrs. kind of do, or they can use Ms. And it's like, why does there need to be so many differences around that? I recently phoned my phone provider for my phone contract to sort it out, and they asked the usual, what's your name, address, and then they said, is it Miss or Mrs.? And I thought, that's an assumption there, because they've heard what they think is a female voice and assuming that I'm going to use Miss or Mrs. And maybe heard my name as being a typically female name. Instead, they might have said, what's your title? Also, I wasn't quite sure why they needed to know my marital status for a phone contract. But hey. So where are you at? Does any of this resonate with you? Does that give you any of a sense of some of this stuff around pronouns that we're going to talk about? I wonder why you're here today. What do you hope to learn from this talk? Now, of course, pronouns, it's different from titles and names because there is a much deeper gender assumptions involved. So which we're going to carry on to talk about. But this was just to give you a bit of a flavour of where you might be at or where I might be at. Okay, let's move on. So before I get diving into the pronoun stuff, I wanted to very briefly go over a few words of terminology, just in case you're not quite sure of some of the words that I might use in the talk today. So transgender, and we say trans for short, is when someone's sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. And cisgender is the opposite of trans, basically. It's when someone's sex assigned at birth does match their gender identity. And often we say cis for short, C-I-S, and we pronounce it cis. Non-binary is when someone identifies as neither male nor female. So they're not a binary gender, because binary means two, male, female. Of course, we know there's way more than two genders. There's loads of other genders, and many people are non-binary. It can also be an umbrella term for many other different genders within that. It means different things for different people. Binary genders are basically if you're one of those two genders, the binary, the male and the female. So you might be a trans man, so you'd be a binary trans person. Or you might be a cis man, so you'd be a binary cis person. I hope that makes sense. Okay, let's move into pronouns. What are pronouns? Basically, words that take place of nouns. We use them so we don't keep repeating someone's name. So these are some examples on the shirts of these people here. She and her, he and his, they and their, them. They're the most common pronouns. So what about pronouns and gender? So he and she are gendered pronouns. He is typically used for men or by men, and she is typically used by women. However, that is not always the case, because not all men use he and not all women use she. And not all non-binary people use they. Many non-binary people might use another pronoun, which we'll talk about later, or they might use he or she. And binary trans people might not necessarily use he or she either. Basically, the bottom line is that pronouns don't necessarily match gender. I am a woman and I use she, her pronouns. So that's why people always get it right, and it matches. And for most people, that is the case, and probably perhaps for many of you watching today. But for many people, that's not the case. And that's where we can get into problems and difficulties around pronouns. Which is why I always say to people, don't guess pronouns. Because if we guess pronouns, we're basically making an assumption about gender. For example, the picture here that we have of this person with a pink top and a frilly skirt and pink shoes. If we were to use she, her for this person, that would be an assumption that we think this person is using she, her. We think, and it's telling that other person that we think we're seeing a woman. We think you're a woman. Because typically, like I said before, she and her is used by women. But actually that might not be the case. And this is why it's really important in trans communities, because because when we assume or we guess someone's pronouns, we're sort of telling that person how we're viewing their gender, which often could be wrong, and that can feel really, really uncomfortable and not great for people, particularly if they're in the process of transitioning. And they might not be matching the assumptions of gender that people may expect. Also, just to say that gender expression doesn't always tell us what someone's gender is either. Gender identity and gender expression are two different things. For example, many women, perhaps some of you listening today, might have a masculine haircut and wear more masculine clothes. So you kind of express your gender in a more of a masculine way, but your identity as a woman, you're a woman. So if people were to see your gender expression and start calling you he, that might not feel a bit not quite right. And this is important that we think about this with trans people too. Also, the voice doesn't tell us what someone's pronouns are. So if you're talking to someone on the phone and you hear a deep voice, it's important that we don't automatically use he and him pronouns, because that would be telling that person that we're thinking of them as a man. Again, like my example earlier, gendered names that can kind of give over if someone's name, for example, my name is Chloe, is quite typically gendered as a female name. It might not that doesn't necessarily mean that my pronouns are she and her. Often it would be the case, but not always. Also, there's many people that have names that are not gendered. For example, Sam or Alex or Joe. So it doesn't always go like that. So pronouns are typically public things that we share with people, like we share our names, and gender identity is typically private. Okay, so part 2, we're going to talk about gender neutral pronouns, why pronouns are not preferred, alternating pronouns, and no pronouns. And just to remind you all, if there's things that aren't quite making sense or you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A box and we'll have time at the end. We hope to have around 15 minutes at the end to look at questions. So hopefully I can clarify things if there was things that you weren't quite getting in that section there. So feel free to keep popping your questions in. So, gender neutral pronouns. The most common gender neutral pronouns, in my experience certainly as a counsellor and in everyday life with the people that I meet, tends to be they, them and theirs. They can be singular and it can also be plural. Now, as I said at the beginning, I do lots of training workshops for counsellors, and many people say to me, oh, but the they is a plural. It doesn't make sense to me to use it singularly, and they can get very confused and find it difficult to grapple with that. I mean, actually, and this is something that I see a lot, not necessarily just with counsellors, that people might not understand or might not realise that it is a singular as well. And it is completely grammatically correct to use they as a singular pronoun. And they has been used singularly since the 14th century. So if you're not convinced, there's hundreds of years of evidence. There's actually, they has been used in Shakespeare texts, Jane Austen. So it's all over our literature over hundreds of years in a singular form. So it's not some newfangled thing that suddenly just popped up, like some people might think. That's not the case. And if you're still not convinced, let's have a look about how I'm going to show you actually how we actually use they, them singularly without even thinking. So just to give you an example. So someone has left their bag. I think I'll wait here in the case they come back for it. Feels like a natural sentence that you've probably said before. We're clearly talking about one person there. You can see there's just one bag. I haven't said lots of bags. There's no plural there. Because there's only one person. We've said they and their. So it wouldn't make sense for us to say someone has left his/her bag. I think I'll wait here in case she/he comes back for it. I don't think anyone really speaks like that. But sometimes when we read things, people write in that way, but that actually is not really how we speak. And that's not very inclusive because it's completely missing out more gender neutral pronouns. So it's a much friendlier way to just say they or their or them. The difference is when we see somebody or we hear their voice or we start thinking about, because if we start giving a picture of gender, that when it's just someone's bag, we don't end up using those gendered pronouns. I say plurals there. Unless, of course, maybe it's a gendered bag, and perhaps we do find ourselves using if it's a stereotypically gendered bag, and that's probably not okay either. But what if it was keys? We'd have no idea. Could be anybody's keys. Okay. So neopronouns. I wonder if you've heard of neopronouns before. Neopronouns mean, neo meaning new, and pronouns developed from the 20th century to today. So they're not necessarily always new. They could have been developed in the 19th century as well, but they're generally newer than the other pronouns we've been talking about so far. Some examples of neopronouns are sie, hier, hiers, ear, pair, pairs. They tend to be gender neutral ways of using pronouns, but not necessarily. They're not necessarily used by non-binary folks, but often if someone is using those pronouns, they're possibly more likely to be non-binary, but not always. I guess you just don't know. It depends on the person. They can also be used by many men and women too, just like many men and women would use they and them. And again, back to what I was saying earlier, just because we know someone's pronouns, it doesn't mean we know their gender identity. That's a private issue. We don't need to know that. But the reason I'm mentioning them is it's important to be familiar with them and to know of them. And then sometimes people say to me, yeah, but what if it's a pronoun I never heard of? How am I supposed to use that? You could just check with the person, and they might be able to explain with you how they might want you to use those pronouns. And also, would you say that if you came across somebody who's had a name you've never heard of, like a really unfamiliar name, like people can use any name they want. Parents can name their child any name they want, and people can change their name to any name they want. Likewise with pronouns, it's their choice and it's their pronouns. All we need to do is to respect that and to use the name or the pronouns and the pronouns that the person is asking for. Okay. So the next slide is the problem with saying preferred pronouns. This is something that people perhaps used to say a lot, and now we don't say this because it really feels a bit clunky. And I think that's where it's come from, by saying, oh, what's your preferred pronouns? We wouldn't say that because using the word preferred gives the impression that it's not a real pronoun and it's not important. And another option is okay. It's just a preference, basically. Like saying, oh, I wouldn't say, oh, my preferred name's Chloe. It's like, my name is Chloe. So instead, we could just say quite simply, what are your pronouns? Instead of saying, what are your preferred pronouns? Because that's not really okay to say that. I hope that makes sense. Okay. What about alternating pronouns? Some people may have only shared their pronouns in different contexts or certain contexts. For example, you may be a student and your friend may have shared with you that they would like you to go by, they would like to go by they, them pronouns with you going forward, or you and your small group of friends. But they don't want you to use they, them pronouns in front of the lecturers. In this case, you would need to use a mix of pronouns depending on which context you're in. And that is something that you would be important to check in with that individual, so that you know who knows and who doesn't know about which pronouns they're using. Because it may be that they don't feel comfortable with sharing with the lecturers yet, or perhaps they're going through a process of trying out different pronouns to see how that feels, just like somebody might change their name and see how that feels before officially changing it. Or it may be that they actually want to continue to only use they, them in their very small group of friends, and they're very confident and comfortable with those pronouns, but not in a wider setting. And that's how they're going to be want to be referred ongoing. So there could be a whole host of different reasons, basically. Also, some people use a mix of pronouns for other reasons. And I guess you don't really need to know the reason. There's some examples of she and they. They, he, she, any combination really of pronouns. Many people use a combination of different pronouns. And this is completely valid, and we must respect this. So, for example, we don't need to know why they're using a mix of pronouns, but what we might want to check is what context might we use those pronouns in. Because it might be that they want a mixture all the time. So, for example, with the first example, if it was she and they, we would try to alternate using she and they when we're talking about them, rather than just using one. So what we shouldn't do is just say, oh, well, just use she because it's easier and I'm more comfortable with that. That wouldn't really be okay. We would need to use both if that's what they've asked for. Okay. Also, to be aware that people's pronouns can and do change. As a counsellor myself, I ask people at the beginning of working with them what their pronouns are, and it's incredibly common for people to change their pronouns through the time that we're working together. And I just check in with them what pronouns they want me to use for them, and I would change that on the paperwork, and so that I've got a note of that. And you might be thinking, but I wouldn't be using the pronouns if I'm speaking to them one-to-one. But as counsellors, we have clinical supervision, so we are talking in a confidential space about that person. So it's really important that we're using those pronouns even when that person's not in the room. And that is really important in everyday life for everyone else who's obviously not a counsellor. If your friend is using those pronouns, to try to use them even when that person's not in the room. Okay. What about no pronouns? Some people are pronoun indifferent, they would describe themselves as. And that's when someone doesn't mind which pronouns people use for them. It just doesn't make a difference to them. They really don't mind. So to give you an example of this, somebody might, maybe their parents called them Kate, and lots of people call them Katie. And you might say, oh, which name would you rather I use for you? And they're like, I really don't mind. And they just don't like, people use both, and it doesn't matter to them. But some people are like, no, it has to be Katie. And if that is the name, that is my name. And I really hate it when you call me Kate. So maybe you've got an experience of that around names that might help you understand this. So, and then we've got null pronoun, if I can say this, it's a tongue twister, null pronominal. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, so apologies if I am. That's when someone doesn't want to be referred to by any pronouns. When somebody has specifically said they don't want you to use pronouns for them, which again is completely valid, and many people do this. So instead, if we were talking about them, we would, to not use any pronouns, we would use their name or a nickname, or we'd try and reform the sentence so it's not using, so we're not using a pronoun. Can be a little bit trickier to get your head around, but it's something that's important, and it's really important that we respect that for these people. Okay. So, part 3, inclusive language and my 5 top tips around pronouns. Hoping this is all making sense. As I said before, if there's anything that you're not sure about, or you want to ask a question, pop it in the Q&A box and we'll try and get to it at the end. We'll have some time at the end to do some questions. Okay, so let's start with inclusive language. Put together some examples of things that, of ways that we might change our language to be a bit more inclusive of all genders. So instead of saying, do you have a boyfriend, which implies that that other person would have a boyfriend or would have a male partner, I guess. Particularly if you're saying that to a woman, it's perhaps implying that you think they're heterosexual. We might say, are you dating anyone? Do you have a partner, or are you in a relationship? It's just a wider way of speaking and not assuming a gender of the person. Another example is, instead of saying, I spoke to the doctor and he recommended I have some counselling, I've underlined he here just to show you that where the pronoun is that I've used. By saying that, we perhaps are making an assumption that the doctor uses he, him pronouns. Perhaps we've seen a doctor who we think is a man and we've inadvertently said he, when actually we might not know what their pronouns are. We might, that the GP surgery might be really progressive and they might have their pronouns on the website or on some kind of paperwork that you know for sure that is the doctor's pronouns and you can use them. Then that's different. But if we don't know, which is more likely often the case, by just saying he because we think we've seen a man is not really okay. So instead we just say, I spoke to the doctor and they recommended I have some counselling. We're talking about one person there, and we just use that gender neutral word. They is a really friendly and inclusive way of not assuming the gender or the pronoun of that person. We can use they pronouns until or unless we know any different, and that's generally accepted as quite good practice. You can see how we might phrase that differently. Another example, inclusive language. Instead of saying yes sir or yes ma'am, like you might perhaps you work in a customer facing role where maybe you work in a cafe or a restaurant or a bar alongside your studying, and you've been taught to sort of be professional and polite to customers, and perhaps you've been taught to say these phrases. I hope not, because they're quite gendered, very gendered, and very assuming of gender. And perhaps you're already doing this and you know this already, but you could say just, good morning, how can I help you? Could I help the next person? So there's ways that we can be professional and friendly without having to say sir or ma'am. And it's quite easy to change it. And lastly, with inclusive language, if we look at this image here of this person giving a talk, perhaps in a lecture hall, we, instead of saying ladies and gentlemen or boys and girls, which is totally missing out non-binary people and assuming gender of our audience, we might just say students, colleagues, everyone. And notice how I said this person giving a talk. It could be so easy to say this woman because we see a pinkish top and long hair and typical sort of feminine signs, but we have no idea if this person is a woman and what pronouns they might use as well. Okay, so I've left the 5 top tips to the end because I felt like it was really important to give you an overview of pronouns and all of the things that I've covered really today. And these are kind of some lasting things for you to hopefully remember that you can use in your day-to-day life, having learned a bit more about pronouns. So what are they? The first one is ask. So what I mean by that is, as I said earlier, we don't know someone's pronouns until we ask. So try to get in the habit of asking people what their pronouns are, just like we might ask what someone's name is. We don't have to ask everybody we pass in the street. That would be a bit strange because we wouldn't pass people in the street and say, oh, what's your name, to random people. But if it's someone we're going to have an ongoing kind of conversation or relationship with, where we would normally be knowing their name, we'd be normally sharing names, we might ask them what their pronouns are. And we might want to do that on a one-to-one basis, so that might feel more comfortable for both of you. It's up to you how you might want to do that. So tip number 2, so once you've asked, use those pronouns. Make sure you use them not even when the other person is not in the room. It's really important that we're validating and continue to use those pronouns, because then what was the point in asking if we weren't going to use the pronouns we've been given? Okay, tip number 3, respect. I really like this image of this mug with the pink strange liquid coming out and it's saying doing my best. Because I think as long as you're doing your best and you're trying your best to be inclusive, that's really, really important. And you're not purposely trying to misgender or to get things wrong. That's a very different thing. But if we make a mistake when we're doing our best, then that's different. So we must respect those pronouns. And if we do make a mistake and we notice it in the moment when we're talking, that's okay. But we need to apologize and we need to correct ourselves, and then we need to move on. Don't make a big deal about it, because then that kind of puts a spotlight on you, the person making a mistake. And actually, what about the other person? And that kind of just feels a bit awkward. And many people that I work with really tell me they really don't like that when people make a big deal out of they're getting the pronouns wrong. What they'd rather the people do is just, apologize and correct themselves and move on. And also, they'd rather that they make an effort to get it right next time. So just try to do your best and get it right. It's not going to come overnight. If it's an unfamiliar pronoun, perhaps. Which is why I say tip number 4 is to practice. In my workshops that I do with counsellors, I get people to do like case studies and role plays to practice perhaps unfamiliar pronouns like they and them. Now, you might be watching this and that might not be your thing. And so there's other ways that you can practice with your friends, like the example I gave about the doctor, when I said you could just say they recommended counselling or mindfulness or whatever it is that they recommended, rather than saying he. So when you're talking about another, you went to the dentist or the hairdresser or another professional or something, and you're telling somebody about that experience where you've likely not found out what their pronouns are, you can describe that experience in that person by using a gender neutral pronoun like they and them. And that will help you practice speaking like that if you haven't got anyone in your life at the moment that are using those pronouns. Another quite fun way to practice is with pets. Some people find it helpful to, like, if you go to walk in the park and you see, perhaps you like dogs and you see a dog that you like, you might say, oh, I really like that dog. I wish I wish they were my pet, rather than saying, I wish he was my pet or I wish she was my pet, because we don't know the gender, we don't know the pronouns of the dog. And it can just be a more fun and natural way of starting to use those they, them pronouns in our conversations. Okay, last tip is to share. So what I mean by that is two things. Sharing your pronouns when you're asking somebody what someone's pronouns are. Sometimes a good way of doing that is by starting it by saying, hi, my name's Chloe and my pronouns are she, her. What's yours? So you're kind of sharing yours before expecting them to share theirs. Other ways that you might be wanting to share your pronouns, what I do is I put my pronouns in my email signature. If there's the University of Wolverhampton staff listening, or if you're in another professional role, you might want to think about putting your pronouns in your email signature. It's a really friendly, inclusive way of talking to your audience. And even if you're not professional, you could still do that. You might want to put your pronouns in your social media bios. That's something I do as well. Or on your Zoom name. It's normally coming up on my Zoom name. I'm not quite sure why it seems to have dropped off today. So yeah, you could just put it in brackets after your name. And this is particularly important if you're from a privileged position where everyone always gets your pronouns right. Because you might be thinking, why do I need to share them? But that's exactly why, because other people who might find it more uncomfortable or difficult to share their pronouns with you, if they can see that you've shared yours, it gives them a signal that you're thinking about it and you care about pronouns. So it's a really easy way of doing something like that. Okay, so we're almost there. Just a quick refresher to remember the 5 top tips. My 5 top tips: ask, use, respect, practice, and share. And lastly, I just love this image, this dog with the ears coming up. Listen out for pronouns. We don't always necessarily need to ask people's pronouns. We can hear them when other people are talking about somebody. We'll be able to hear what the pronouns are that somebody's using. And this is something I'm doing in the counselling room all the time, and people are talking about other people. And just to remember, we can use they pronouns until or unless we're told otherwise. Okay, so that's it. Just a reminder that the summary of this talk I put together in a free pronouns guide, which is available to download from that link there. bit.ly/pronouns guide. All you have to do is follow that link, pop your name and email in, and you will immediately get a copy to download of that guide, which summarises everything we've spoken about. Okay, so we've got some time for questions. Let's stop the share. I'd love to hear where you're at, what you want to ask about this.
Thanks, Chloe. We've got a ton of questions to get.
Oh, gosh. Oh, I can see here. Wow, 29.
One thing that I've noticed, there's a thread through quite a lot of the questions when you were saying how you ask people what their pronouns are, but particularly there are some teachers here, some lecturers here, and you talked about earlier on that, you know, maybe there might be students who are still figuring out what pronouns they want to use. How would you advise them sort of to approach their students if they were sort of still unsure?
Yeah, well, I think there's different ways that it could be done. We could ask our students in sort of electronically, like there could be something that they can fill in, so it takes away the sting of that they don't have to be approached. Or we could try and talk to them one-to-one. That's probably a bit not very practical unless we were meeting with our students regularly, and it might put some people on the spot, particularly if they're not quite used to it. I find doing it in some kind of paperwork, as in my counselling work, works really well because it gives them that chance to just think about it. And also I put like in brackets, like say, what's your pronouns? I'd be like, e.g., she, her, they, because sometimes people are like, I don't know what that means. And then you don't want them to feel like they can't answer, that they might not answer because they just don't know what that means. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Wow, it's really complex, isn't it? Okay, I'm just going to go through these now, and hopefully we've covered a lot of them anyway. In business, and this is an interesting one, many companies will use dear sir, madam on letters. What should we be using to be more inclusive and so we don't make assumptions or offend? That's really interesting because people do that all the time, don't they?
Yeah.
I guess it's something they really need to address.
You mean when people write sir / Matt, like write both because they're not sure, and it's might not be either.
It might be either, yeah.
Yeah. I think this is back to the example I used earlier when I said, like, when people say yes sir or yes ma'am, like if they're working in a customer service facing role and they've kind of been taught to, that's the professional and polite way to speak. But and I think that's similar where you're saying about the dear sir, madam. That's how we've been traditionally taught to write a letter. I'm not sure what the recommended kind of more inclusive word would be to use instead, but I would just write their name, really. I think that would probably be fine, or if it's a group message, to just say like everyone, or just find a more sort of, I mean, it might come across a little bit more informal, but I think that's more important than making a judgment about a gender.
Okay, thanks for that question. This one from Simon. Not sure on binary gender still. What's the difference between cis male and binary gender male?
It's the same, sort of the same. So, okay, so binary means two. So it comes from like computer language where we've got ones and twos, and the binary system of there being only those two options in a machine. But actually we're not machines, we're humans. So there's more than two options. Someone who's got a binary gender, it basically means that their gender is either male or female, because it's one of those two options. So someone could be a binary cis person or a binary trans person. Does that make more sense? So you could be a binary cis woman or a binary cis man or a binary trans woman or a binary trans man. They're binary genders. We don't need to even necessarily use the cis or the trans. We can just say binary man or binary woman.
Okay, yeah.
Depends on the context.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. This one from Anonymous. Why do people think that they is plural? Is that a regional thing like you, thee, thou?
I think because we actually do use it as plural. We're using it all the time when we are talking about lots of people. We would say they. That is how we speak, and it is genuinely and generally used in our language as a plural. But what the point is that it's also used as a singular, and I think that is where sometimes people can get confused about that, because it's very valid in either sense. Okay,
this one, Anonymous asks, how do we use the neo pronouns?
What do you mean? Like in what context? Or
Anonymous, do you want to just sort of expand on that? We'll come back to that one. Okay. Julie asks, she's wondering if there are any resources that can help when supporting a young client but their parent is not comfortable and is struggling with their child's gender and sexuality.
There are two fantastic charities that you might want to get in touch with. Mermaids is one of them, and Gendered Intelligence is another one. I actually have a free LGBTQ resources hub on my website that's got links to both of those and loads of other free resources and websites and stuff. So that might be a good place to check to find out more information.
Okay, fab. This one from Anonymous also. How do you deal with people who don't understand the question, what are your pronouns? Some of my parents' generation probably wouldn't understand that question. I think that's a really fair point.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say, like what I said earlier, like if you are doing it if you're doing in paperwork, particularly, like just to put an example, just put like e.g. she, her, they. Or if I was doing it in person with somebody, I would say for example, my pronouns are she and her. I wonder, are those the pronouns you use, or do you use other pronouns? And often, and if you give some examples, they'll probably understand what you mean from that.
Okay.
I think it's really important on that point is that we clarify that the reason we're asking, because they might be like wondering, like, isn't it obvious? Because I've experienced that a lot when I've worked in, particularly I've worked in non-LGBTQ settings. They've been like, because they're not used to being asked. And I'm like, well, I actually ask this to everyone. Not making any assumptions. And it's just really important that we just check with everybody.
Yeah.
It's just a question I ask everybody. And
yeah.
I have no idea, and I wouldn't want to guess, and I wouldn't want to get it wrong. But it's not anything special about you. Because sometimes people might be thinking, oh, what do you mean? And they're kind of wondering if there's a question about their gender and can be offended, which is not what we want either, which is a bit strange.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the next question is sort of how to educate and correct these family members, you know, because I guess it can be quite awkward, can't it, when you're trying to sort of correct them. It's a bit of a tricky one.
Yeah, sort of like gentle, you know, like we would do in other ways, particularly if you're a teacher, and it's a way you kind of manage in a way that you're trying to sort of correct somebody, but in a gentle way. So it's not kind of so accusationary that they're kind of like, oh, and then they run a mile. So you're kind of trying to bring them in and kind of help them understand why you're correcting them and doing it in a friendly way. It's important.
Okay. This one's from a teacher, and she said that I'm just assuming it's a she. Say I've just done that. I've just done the very thing you said to not do.
I was so focused on the question I didn't even notice. But yeah, well done for spotting it. Pressure.
My students are not asked what their pronoun is. Last year, I created an About Me document which asks students what their preferred pronoun is, which I'll now change. And this has helped me get to know a whole group better during the shift to online teaching. I consider myself to be an inclusive teacher, but should this information be provided on class lists if disclosed by the student? If so, why isn't this information passed on to the teacher? And then they go on to say that they enjoyed your talk.
I think that's a great comment. When I worked as a youth worker, and that was in an LGBTQ setting, we had like this thing they used to tick at the door when they came in with their name, and they'd have to put, like, if there was a different name they were going by that day, and we'd have a list for them to put their current pronouns on that day. And some people were reluctant to fill it in, and it was a bit of a shame, because then it was always the people who their pronouns were people weren't always getting them right. They were filling in, and we're like, no, but it's important that everyone's filling that in, and that we're, as youth workers, are knowing what's the pronouns you're using for this session today. So that's the thing they might be changing.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that question. There's a couple of questions here that they're kind of really similar, that they're asking how to respond if they're being mispronounced. You know, I guess in a setting where they don't want to draw attention, but obviously they're being misgendered in some way.
Yeah, I think it's important to find a way to, for example, if it was in a class and the teacher or another classmate was doing it, to find a way to check in with that person and to tell them that they've made a mistake. You might want to get an ally, someone on your side, a friend to come with you to get that support, to kind of help correct that person, really.
Okay.
So everybody's knowing. You might want to ask the teacher to do a refresher to remind people it's important that we're respecting people's pronouns.
Okay, thank you for that question. And this one from Caitlin. With regard to tip 1, occasionally trans people do not like being asked, as it makes them feel that you see them as trans. Yeah. Do you think that by saying my pronouns are, when first meeting them, it gives them the option to let you know theirs without being asked?
Yeah, absolutely. And I totally agree with that. And I think that is the thing that this can get more complicated. I guess I've tried to simplify it, but it can actually get more complicated. And I think that is certainly a good point. So yeah, by sharing our own pronouns, and we don't have to say directly, I know I said that you could say that, but you don't have to say, what are your pronouns? You could say, oh, I wonder what pronouns you use, or if you want to share your pronouns at any point, then feel free, or something like that.
Okay.
Could soften it.
Someone's from Anonymous. I wonder if deliberately using the wrong pronoun would be a criminal offence under diversity laws?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't know for sure about that, but I think that it's really not okay to deliberately use the wrong pronouns or the wrong name, because that is, yeah, really offensive, and that's not okay.
Okay. This one from Sharon asks, could you please explain cisgender in more detail?
So cisgender is when somebody's, like I said, I just refresh what I said earlier, is when their sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. So, for example, when I was born, people thought that I was a girl, a baby girl, and so my sex assigned at birth was female. And then as I was growing up into adulthood, I identify as a woman. So it matches my sex assigned at birth, my kind of internal, how I feel about my gender, but also my physical gender. So the majority of the population would most likely be cisgender.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So this one from Anonymous. In keeping notes on clients in therapy, we use a client's pronouns. Could that not be quite outing for someone, even though, of course, the notes are confidential?
Well, it could be. Some people you can write therapy notes without using pronouns, like keeping them it depends on the style that you've been trained, but you can keep them very brief so you're not specifically using pronouns. Or another way of doing it is you could use they and them for all of your clients in a neutral way, and some people let their clients know, I will use they them for everyone in my notes, just to keep things neutral and confidential. If you have a problem with that, let me know, and I'm happy to change that for you.
Would you include a question asking a client's pronouns in the contract?
Not in the contract as such, but like on a kind of like a form that you would gather their other details, like their phone number and things like that. That's what I do. Like I have like a registration form, and one of the question is what are your pronouns, and I say an example, and then it just gives them the chance to share it there and then, and I don't have to get a few sessions in and think, oh, I haven't remembered to ask them, or I'm not quite sure. And because the difficulty is when we only ask people who we think might be trans, and that's not okay. We ask all of our clients. I think that's what I would suggest to do.
Okay, this is an interesting one. Can you use those neutral pronouns with children under 5 years?
I think yes. I think why not? Like there's no reason not to. This is a difficult one around children. And I was thinking about this just the other day, actually, about what to do around pronouns for children and babies. And I was thinking about the fact that really it's a tricky one because they haven't got the ability to consent yet. So when a baby is born, the parents typically are the people who are naming that child. So they've chosen that name, and they also choose, I guess they essentially choose the pronouns, normally based on the sex assigned at birth. But then when a child gets to around 4 or 5, that's generally when people tend to become more aware of their gender. So they might voice that they feel that their gender is not what people are assuming. And so we might use different pronouns at that stage.
Okay, that's interesting. As a heterosexual woman, would my pronoun be she, her?
Not necessarily, because heterosexuality is a sexuality, so that's basically telling us who you're attracted to. So if someone's saying they're a heterosexual woman, I'm imagining you're meaning that you have relationships with men. And I think that's the really important thing, that we don't get confused, that sexuality and gender is not the same.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Chloe, are you all right for time?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. I won't go through all of them.
It's really important, yeah. And if there's questions that people I haven't managed to answer, I'm more than happy people want to email them to me, and I can try and answer from there. But yeah, obviously not everyone else will hear the answer.
Okay, that's fab. Thanks. This one from Randall. When one wishes to respect the null pronoun, how does one deal with phrases that really call for a pronoun, like Bill likes to brag about his, her, their son? If one tries to respect the null pronoun by saying Bill likes to brag about Bill's son, seems rather confusing.
Yeah. I think that the best thing is to check with the person, and to see how would they want, because they have very likely come across this with other people in their life that are not quite sure about how you're going to respect that. Typically, in my experience, it tends to be the name that's used instead, but there might be other ways that person manages it, or rephrases the sentence, or just doesn't like to be referred to in third person. Perhaps there's another way we can do that. That we just don't talk about them.
Yeah. Okay. Could you please explain more about being pronoun indifferent?
So what I meant by that was, when sometimes people describe themselves as pronoun indifferent when they just don't mind what the pronouns are. So some people, and I've worked with many clients in this situation, and it doesn't have as much of a emotional charge if you use a different pronoun for them. It doesn't matter to them that much. And I suppose that's why I gave the example earlier of how you may have come across people, or you may be one people yourself, who you don't really mind when people use different forms of your name. Like you don't mind if some people call you Joe or Joey or Josephine, and people say, well, which one would you want me to use? And I just don't mind.
Okay.
It's not that emotional charge.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I was a youth leader at my church, which is not really affirming of trans, non-binary people. I had LGBTQ teens in my group and always tried to be affirming and supportive as much as I could in that environment. How could I help these young people to find their pronouns and feel accepted in that environment?
Oh God, that sounds really difficult. Yeah, really difficult space to do that in it, particularly if the organisation is not that inclusive. But I think still it's still okay to do inclusive stuff, even if the organisation isn't. And that might be really valuable for them. That perhaps you do a session about pronouns, and you just spend 10-20 minutes just explaining a little bit about what pronouns are and why they're important, and that you really welcome people to share them if they feel comfortable with that, because you don't want to make assumptions or something like that.
That's a good idea. Okay, thank you for that question. An interesting one. As a uni lecturer on open days and applicant days, is it more appropriate to stick to using their names rather than pronouns so as not to cause any challenges and offences?
Yeah, you could do that. You could just stick to using their names. What if they're talking about somebody else and you haven't had the chance to ask what their pronouns are? Or you could just use they, them pronouns, which is generally accepted as best practice if you haven't had the chance to ask. I always say, like, using they and them until or unless you know any different can be really helpful. And if we are really practiced at doing that, it's going to become more and more familiar.
Okay, thank you. I think we might have to leave it there because there are loads more questions. I apologise that we couldn't get to all of them, and we may have already answered some of them.
Yeah.
Please do contact Chloe, as she said, if you do have any burning questions that you need the answers to.
Yeah.
Alternatively, this is being recorded, so we'll be posting it up in the next few days on the university's YouTube channel. So I think if you watch it back, it may sort of, the answer might be in there somewhere.
Yeah.
Chloe, is there anything else you want to add before we go?
No, I think I've just been such a pleasure to being able to share this with you all. As I said in the event description, I'm so passionate about this and it feels so important. And it's great to have brought my kind of knowledge and experience to so many people, and there's so many people interested in this. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for all your questions. And yeah, don't forget that there is the free guide. If you want to download that, then hopefully that'll be helpful to kind of refresh your memory as well. And then you'll get more info from me, other free resources if you want to stay in touch and learn more from me about the other blogs and things that I write. There's always stuff that I'm putting out for free, basically, to hopefully help more people. That's
great. Thank you, Chloe. That was so incredibly useful. I hope everyone enjoyed that at home. Come again, please. Let's have you in again. I just think that was super interesting. Coming up at 6 p.m, we will be joining journalist Andrea Carlo, and he will be talking about the life of Pierre Seal and the forgotten LGBT plus victims of the Holocaust. So do sign up for that if you haven't already. I hope to see you all there. Thanks for watching. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.